Well, good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to see a great crowd. This is our first Veterans Day live event since 2019, so thank goodness we've emerged from the COVID-19 and are able to do this. Welcome to Harding Hall and to our tradition of honoring veterans. I'm GPO's Chief of Staff, Steve LeBlanc, and it is an honor to be here as your Master of Ceremonies this morning. I am a veteran. I served 23 years in the United States Marine Corps as a helicopter pilot and retired as a lieutenant colonel in 2004. My father was a Marine, and he fought in the Korean War, and I also have two daughters who served on active duty. One was a Marine and one was in the Navy. She's still in the Navy Nursing Corps. I know that there are many veterans here today and many family members and friends who love and hold veterans close to their heart. Today is a celebration to honor America's veterans for their patriotism, love of country, and willingness to serve and sacrifice for our common good. I'd like to ask you all to stand so that we can listen to the national anthem. Thank you. Please be seated. I'd like to begin today's program by introducing our director of the GPO, Hugh Halpern. Our director since 2019, he led us through what was perhaps the biggest disruption to GPO's operations since the Civil War. As we all know, a few short months into his tenure, the COVID-19 pandemic hit. And it was his steady hand, clear direction, and concern for our well-being while being focused on the mission at hand that got our agency through those tough times. We are a stronger team now and continue to serve the federal government and the American people through his leadership. Ladies and gentlemen, GPO's Director, Hugh Halpern.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks, everyone. It is really good to see everyone. So I'm also glad that some of our teammates can join us virtually today. So the last time I got to welcome people to this room was our Black History Month event in February 2020. And that was just a few weeks before COVID sort of turned everybody's life upside down. Before I turn to today's program, it's worth noting that we are celebrating Harding Hall's 100th anniversary. This room's been used for a lot of events, town hall meetings, agency milestone events, even war bond dances in World War II, and our annual Christmas tree display. But of all of those events, none is more important than honoring our teammates who have served our country through our armed forces. I'm proud that we can restart that tradition today. So many of you know how proud I am that Last year, we made Forbes magazine's list of America's best employers. I'm excited to be able to announce today that Forbes will also list GPO as one of the best employers for veterans. GPO has been, thank you. We've been employing veterans since the Civil War. Today, we have nearly 640 veterans serving as your teammates. That's about 40% of our entire team. If you have a moment, visit GPO's historic Veterans Landing, located on the main front staircase in Building A. Commemorates the sacrifices made by GPO employees in service of their country in both war and peace. So, the history of Veterans Landing goes back to 1921, when public printer George Carter gave permission for the landing to be used for a funeral service for Private Charles A.R. Jacobs, a GPO teammate and Marine killed in action on October 3rd, 1918 in France. We have a lot of current and former teammates that served in the Vietnam conflict. We'll hear more from our speakers today about the soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines that served in that Southeast Asia theater shortly. GPO also played a small part in memorializing those who lost their lives while we were in Vietnam. On March 25th, 1969, Illinois Congressman Paul Findley inserted the names of 35,000 American soldiers who died in Vietnam into the congressional record. GPO printed 100,000 copies of that edition of the record, and it became one of the most requested publications from the agency. This list, updated twice a year and published by GPO, became the list used to inscribe names onto the wall of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. So, many of you know, my son's a paratrooper. He served in the 82nd Airborne Division. Today, as we speak, he's on a training exercise for his deployment. Eventually, he'll be a veteran. Oh, excuse me. We'll be thanking him. So let's keep him, as well as all of our other soldiers, sailors, Marines, airmen, and guardians who currently serve or have served in the past, in our thoughts today and every day. Thank you.
Thank you, Hugh. It's now my pleasure to introduce our first guest speaker, Mr. Timothy Tetz. Since his service with the United States Coast Guard, Tim has spent the majority of his professional career working with and on behalf of veterans and the military. Tim has served as the Secretary of Nevada's Department of Veterans Affairs, the Legislative Director for the American Legion, and the Director of Outreach for the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund. We are honored to have you with us today, Tim, and I'd like to invite you up to the podium.
Director Alpern and distinguished guests, it's a pleasure to be with you today. Gonna come up here and sit. He's got to figure out where he's going to be so that he can make sure he photobombs me in all the photos. My name is Tim Tetz, and I am the Director of Outreach for the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund. I've spent a career taking care of veterans and trying to make certain that they get the care that they deserve. I was brought in as a volunteer back in 1999 to help pass legislation for the Vietnam Memorial. And once I passed that, in 2012, the founder, Jan Scruggs, came to me and said, hey, we want you to come inside and work for us on the inside. And I've been there ever since. And on the first day of my job, they asked me to take over a project. It was called the Hometown Heroes Project. You see, in 2001, as an organization, we looked at the wall and we looked at this new thing called the internet. And they said it was going to go somewhere. And we figured we needed to have a web page. So we put web pages out there and we put names on it. And in 2001, we began an effort because we recognized that when you look down at the memorial, it wasn't just Vietnam veterans that were there at the memorial. You see, if you were going to go down there today, you'd discover two things. First off, we're in the middle of a 4-day effort to read all 58,281 names of every single man and woman who died in Vietnam. It takes 16 hours a day, and it spans over 4 days as we read those, and it'll culminate on Veterans Day. We do that every 5 years. But when you were down there yesterday, as I was for the reading of the names, and you look around, you see the close-up groups, and you see the high school kids and the college kids, and you quickly realize that among the 3.6 million Americans and visitors that we have to the wall last year, over half of them weren't alive. They weren't even alive in 1982, only 40 years ago when the wall was created. To them, a name on that wall is a figment of an imagination. They don't see the dimples. They don't see the boy they dated. They don't see the brother or sister or the uncle that is missing from the Thanksgiving table. They just see a name. And so in 2001, we began an effort where we were going to find a photograph for every one of the 58,281 names. It was a fanciful goal. We didn't think we would get there. We didn't think we'd ever go there because in the 60s, in the 50s, in the 70s, we didn't all walk around with cameras in our pockets. So cameras and photos were rare. And it was because of that effort to put that face with a name that we began that program. And slowly, as we looked across the nation and started to gather speed on this effort, and the internet became more prominent and people came to our website, they discovered what we were looking for, these pictures. And they said, I think I have a picture. It started with families, for them to sit there and say, I have the picture of the last time I put my brother on that plane at National Airport. I have a picture of my classmate when he was catching the winning touchdown catch for the state championship game. We accepted them, we put them in our collection, and we realized that these men and women started to come alive. And we'd reach out to special groups, maybe a college or the military academy, and say, we need your help. We need your help in helping us find these pictures. And of course, they were all too eager and ready to help us honor and remember them by finding the pictures of their classmates and their buddies. And slowly but surely, it grew and grew. And in 2012, we had about 15,000 pictures when I joined. 15,000 pictures, realizing how far we still had to go. But then we started to find a new class of volunteers. A new class of volunteers which included Andrew and others who came at it from a different perspective. You see, they didn't necessarily come at it with a buddy who they had lost on the battlefield. They didn't come after it because of a classmate or because it was of their era. Came after it because they were drawn to the project. Maybe they saw an article about it and they wanted to make certain that they found all of them from Hawaii. Maybe they knew they had skill set to go out and reach into Facebook and bring those photos in. They started to do that. And slowly this coalition built. And dozens of volunteers turned into hundreds and hundreds. And the pictures continued to roll in. We'd come back from a weekend and we'd have 150, 160 pictures. Not necessarily of individuals who we never had a picture of, but multiple pictures. Because where the average age of the men and women who are on the wall is 22 years and 9 months, that one basic training picture, you know amongst you as veterans, when they stopped yelling at us just long enough to put us in that dress uniform to take that first picture, you had a buzz cut, you were absolutely white in the eyes because you were so scared. That's not necessarily the best picture you've ever taken in your life. And I guarantee you that my basic training picture looks exactly like half of your basic training pictures, no matter what generation we went through. Because it's all about uniformity. So we looked for those other pictures that came, and those continued to come in. And we started to close out states. Those states that only had 160, 170 photos, those were the easy states. But then you get on to the big states. You get on to the big states, and then a new group of people came in. And Andrew, with the help of his contacts within the media and elsewhere, realized that they could drive it from within, because within our hometowns, those small towns across the nation, were these archives of records that they had printed an obituary, that they had written and gone and talked about the story. And we found those pictures in new ways, pictures that didn't exist. Wisconsin was the first state to close out all their pictures of the big states. And Minnesota was in their rivalry with Wisconsin, only a couple of weeks behind. But one of the last pictures they found in Wisconsin, was a young man who dropped out of school when he was in 10th grade. He dropped out of school because this young man didn't have anything going for him in life. He was an orphan. He was adopted by someone who lived across from the church where he was known to frequent. They said it was more common for you to find him in your car if you accidentally left it open on those cold winter nights in Minnesota than it was to find him anywhere else in this town. They couldn't find a photograph of him. People remembered and attended his funeral, and they didn't understand who he was. But we were able to find that basic training picture and bring to life who that individual was and bring those pieces forward. And as we began to close out the states, as we began to get closer and closer, we figured we'd get to 1,000 and it would stall. It didn't stall. We figured we'd get to 100 and then it was going to be the hard ones and we wouldn't go any further. We passed 100 as if we were in the steepest glide path any pilot would ever take. We got down to 12 and we figured it would take us years and certainly we wouldn't close it out. But in August, with the efforts of thousands, we found the last photograph of the 58,281 Americans who were on this wall. And that was the magical moment. Now you sit there and say, well, this is on the internet. We can go and see it on your website, Tim, but what are its other uses? We originally made it because we wanted to build a museum on the National Mall, a museum that would show pictures of everyone. When you went in there on a wall as big as this, it would be the pictures of everyone whose birthday was that day, to bring alive those. And we could add and supplement that, and until there was a memorial built for the OIF and OEF veterans, those who served since September 11th, we would do their pictures as well, tying together the legacy of the Vietnam veterans who said, no one's service will be treated in the manner that I was treated when they return, and we're going to make certain that we respect that. Now, we shelved the idea of building that museum in 2015 because it became too cost prohibitive. But we now take those pictures and we give them out to museums. You can go to the Army Museum and you can see them. You can go to the Marine Corps Museum and you can see them. You can go to museums from coast to coast and you can see it, and they specialize it. And in the last 3 weeks, I've made 3 different slideshows for Texas and Mississippi and West Virginia where they're going to read their own names and show those pictures. Because through those pictures, they realize that these men and women's names come alive. And now, where we thought it was going to be one museum, we have it in museums nationwide. Where we thought it was going to be one purpose, there's this endless purpose of why we have these photographs. So whether you know someone whose name is on the wall, whether you have a family member, you can sit there and go to our wall of faces and open it up and see today's birthdays. And you can see those awkward photos when your parents made you get that haircut and wear the shirt that you didn't like. You can remember when you had to sit down for that graduation photo or that basic training photo. You can see photographs of young fathers holding their firstborn, a firstborn child that they would never see again. Those pictures bring it alive. Those pictures make it magical. I want to close with a story that back in 2015 endured me for this project, made me stand with this project forever. I was with The Wall That Heals. It's our traveling replica wall. Travels around this year to 29 stops. Most we've gone is 40 stops in 1 year. We go into a community, and for 5 days at a time, we sit there and display a wall in their community so they can have the healing and reflective nature of the wall. And one of the displays that we have is a giant 6-foot monitor that shows the photographs of everyone from the county we're in and the counties that touch that county, their names, their photographs, and their faces, to bring them alive so that you can recognize that no matter when you come. It's one of the greatest things that we do. And we were in Marco Island back in 2015, and a gentleman came up to me and asked for my help because he wanted to find a name on the wall. I looked up the name, and I started to walk to the wall, and had commonality. I sat there and talked to him, and I said, well, how did you know him? He said he was my son. I said, wow, it's pretty incredible. And so we walked down towards the apex where his son's name was, and I said to him, that we had had some photographs, and he was taken back. He was taken back, and he said, you have photographs? I said, yeah, we have photographs. We're working to try to get the photographs of all 58,281. And there was an audible gasp. We've walked the following steps, and we went down there closer to the wall, and we knelt down, and he bent over, and I showed him his son's name, and he started to cry. Bawled. His daughter, who was standing behind him, rubbed his shoulder. And as he did that, he said, I'd love to see some pictures if you have them. And I took my iPad and I opened up those pictures. And that gasp was again on his voice because he saw that picture of his son and he was speechless. And his daughter said, Daddy, he looks just like you. And I knew something was amiss. Daddy, he looks just like you. And he was bawling as much as if he had touched the wall again. And I said, well, sir, the pictures we have here are kind of poor. We'd love for you to provide us some additional photos because we want to have as many photos of every single one on the wall to tell their legacy. We want the photos that you have on your mantelpiece here on our wall so everyone can endure that. And he said, Tim, I can't do that. I don't have any pictures of my son. I've never seen him. You see, a couple weeks ago, I got a call out of the blue from my Facebook friend who I had known 50 years ago. She called me up and said, by the way, remember when we dated for that short period of time? I fathered a child. He went off to Vietnam, and he died. And I happened to be driving down the street, and I saw the sign for the Wall That Heals. I saw that you were going to be here in Marco Island. And I knew I had to come. I come to see my son's name. Little did I know, not only do I get to see and touch his name, but I get to see him for the first time. That's the Wall of Faces. That's our mission. And it's because of people like that. It's because of the volunteers who made that happen that these men and women will live on in infamy, and we will, as a country, be able to make certain that we always honor and remember the sacrifice they gave us. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tim. It's now my honor to introduce our next guest speaker, Andrew Johnson. Andrew is at home here at the GPO because printing and publishing runs deep in his DNA. He and his wife, Laura, who's here with us today, published 3 community weekly newspapers in rural Wisconsin for over 30 years. He also comes from a long line in the printing industry that I'm sure he will reference. Andrew also served the newspaper industry as the president of Wisconsin's Newspaper Association in 2010 and the president of the National Newspaper Association in 2018. Andrew and Laura are Gold Star parents. Andrew and Laura's oldest son, David, a U.S. Army First Lieutenant, was killed in action in Afghanistan in 2012. They have been actively leading efforts to locate photos of veterans for the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Faces Project. and building Wisconsin's Gold Star Memorial Trail. It is my pleasure and honor to welcome Andrew Johnson to the podium.
Thank you so much for having me here, Director Halpern and Beth Ann and Tim and Steve, all you guys and the veterans here today. Those of you who served in Vietnam, welcome home. Veterans, I want you to know how much we love you, how much we appreciate you from the bottom of my heart. I am not a veteran, but I am a Gold Star father, so I have a special and close relationship. I fit speaking here today like a glove. I have a very unique resume in my background, and I first talked to you a little bit about my family background in the newspaper and printing business. And then I'm going to have my wife come up and tell you about my son, First Lieutenant David Johnson. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the journey of finding photos with the newspapers throughout the country. And then I'll part with you with the meaning of finding these photos and being here today. So that's what I'm going to talk about. I come from a long line of printers. My great-grandfather was a hand typesetter. You remember the old cases with the little letters, and they would move really fast. You know, the guys that do that, and I don't know if any of you here were with letterpress. That's what my great-grandpa did, and my grandpa Kerber, his name is Edward Kerber. He's from Chicago, and he had an 8th grade education. And he went to work after serving in the United States Navy in World War I. He went to work for a company in Chicago that made plastic mats. And those of us with printing history know that plastic mats were used to transform images in the letterpress days. And my grandfather got it in his head that he would start his own mat company and become one of the nation's largest. So my grandfather did. He started a company called Progressive Matrix in Chicago. It was the largest mat company in the United States. So chances are, if you've ever worked on a letterpress with a mat, you probably worked with one of my grandfather's mats. My grandfather was very successful. He was the type of guy that even when in his later years, he would like drive a train to work. He was that kind of guy. But he came from nothing, absolutely nothing, and he built this great company. My dad is the next person in the story. My dad from Chicago also was a professional race car driver. My dad, he served in peacetime between World War II and Korea in the Army. And my dad was a very mechanical guy. And so he was set up on a blind date with my mother. And I think he took her to a racetrack the first time, and he said, "I'll be right back." And of course, he went and drove the race car. He didn't know what she was getting into. But anyway, they had a World War fast romance, and my mom and dad were married. So my dad married into a family that really helped him as far as his career goes. And he had to stop racing, and one of my relatives owned a small weekly newspaper in northern Illinois called the Lamontier in Lamont, Illinois. And my grandpa set my dad up, bought the paper for him, and helped him get started. And my dad ran the paper. It had a little print shop, a little, a letterpress print shop, and they did job printing and printed the newspaper back then. They like sheet fed, and they turned it over and run it again through the press. So, very old, these little weekly newspapers in that day, and this is in the 50s, in about 55, 56, so it's a long time ago. And so my dad was thinking, he's a mechanical guy, and he liked to tinker with the presses and things, and he thought there must be a better way. And so he went on this journey to find the better way, and so he eventually hooked up with a man named Stanley McBrayer. And those of you know the history of offset printing, that the offset, the separation of the ink and the water came from a lot of the studies down in Houston, Texas. That's where that was. So my dad went down to Texas and worked with this guy named Stanley McBrayer, who was probably the father of offset printing in the newspaper business. And he had some presses made because he was well capitalized because of my grandpa. He had presses made in a machine shop, offset presses, because you couldn't buy a press. I mean, Mr. Goss didn't make presses yet then. So he had one of the first presses in offset. He brought them up to Lamont, Illinois. He bought an old movie theater, and he had his presses in there. And with the advent of the presses, he bought some other weekly newspapers, and he got a lot of customers, little newspapers throughout the northwest of Chicago area. And so he built a pretty good business, and he had 13 newspapers at the time. And Marshall Field III saw what my dad was doing and said, I would like to buy the technology that you have and put it in all of my newspapers. Marshall Field owned the Chicago Sun-Times, and he owned a company called the Metropolitan Printing Company, which my dad built for him. And so my dad converted Marshall's newspapers to offset. And it was a big project. And also at that time, my dad on the side, of course, bought another offset press, and he did have a gloss press at that time. And then he built up another group of newspapers, and he sold those in 1983. It was always my goal to be in the newspaper business. I worked for my family's newspapers when I was in high school and college, but my dad sold his newspapers just before I graduated college. And I really didn't know what I was going to do, because I always thought I would be in the newspaper business. I was trained to run newspapers. My dad made me I had to work in the press room. I had to be a circulation manager. I had to do all these different things. I had to sell ads. I did all these things, and so that's the business I knew. So I went and worked in a different industry for a short time, and one day I got a call from my brother, my older brother, and he said, I found a little weekly newspaper in Wisconsin that's for sale. The publisher had passed away, and he said, would you like to come back to the family business, and I'm sure Dad will lend you the money, and we can get you going in the business. So I talked over with my wife. We went up to this little paper in Mayville, Wisconsin called the Mayville News, and we went up there and we bought it, and my dad set me up really good to get me a little weekly newspaper. And we published a little paper that covered the bowling scores. One time, actually, we forget to, I cut the pages and I missed some bowling scores, about 100 of them, and man, did I get in trouble. I just tell you, I was like, man, those little papers, that was the time when people would put in their little personals. They'd tell you like when they're in the hospital, and if someone had a birthday party, it was about everything about this little town. And my dad only gave me one bit of advice. He said, the paper's not yours, it's the community's, and don't ever mess with that. And he was right, and I did mess with it a couple times, like, oh no, it was their paper. So that's the kind of stuff we covered. Births, announcements, anniversaries, that kind of thing was the news. We had the school news from the school boards and the city news, and on Saturdays I would print. I had a little A.B. Dick press, and I would print little jobs like dance cards and programs and graduation stuff, and so I tried to buy some other newspapers, but I had a real hard time, because at that time in the early 90s, newspapers were extremely expensive, and you could hardly come out on them. They just cost so much money. So I ended up getting a couple more, but the time wasn't right that I could put together a group. And so we had a very small newspaper, and so we ended up having like a total of like 12 or 13 full-time employees and some other part-timers. And in order to save money to make my payments, because I had the newspaper background, I met with my printer one day and said, hey, could I come in plate ready? I know how to make plates. I couldn't afford a rotary press. I was just a small little operation. And so I plated my own paper for 15 years, and I know I've made over 10,000 plates myself. So I do understand a little bit about printing, and so that's in my blood. So I'm nothing like my dad. I'm not a titan in the industry at all. But I do have a terrific background, and my grandpa told me, he says, and this is what happened, but I'm telling you after the fact, he says, maybe just go up to Wisconsin, find a little newspaper, and make a difference. He said, you probably won't make much money, which I didn't, but you won't need much money, but you'll make a tremendous difference in the town you live in. And he was right, and that's what I did do. And so I made it my goal not to be a big newspaper company. I made my goal to be the best newspaper I could be. In order to do that, I had to become familiar with what's going on. We had obviously a fast-pacing industry, changing industry in the 90s, and so I became involved in my newspaper association in the early 2000s in Wisconsin, the Wisconsin Newspaper Association, worked on the board of directors, and I did some lobbying for newspapers, and I became its president in 2010, and then later, after our son was killed, I was given a good offer to work at the National Newspaper Association, that's representing small weekly newspapers throughout the country. And I got to come to Washington, D.C. every year, so that was a pretty good gig. And I was its president in 2018. Okay, one other thing I did do related to the industry, I was one of 2 witnesses in the International Trade Commission newsprint trial. Those of you remember that newsprint, there was a tariff unrighteously put on newsprint, and in 2018 there was a trial at the International Trade Commission. I was selected to represent the newspapers of the United States, and I'm proud to say there's only 3 pieces of evidence in that trial, and one of those pieces is my 3 weekly newspapers. We did win, by the way, 5-0 vote, and unfortunately the paper people turned their backs on us, and paper still stayed high. So, but anyway, we won the trial. Now, I wanted to give you that background because you had to know what am I talking about? Why is he telling me this? Now I'm going to tell you, have my wife come up, read about my son's resume, and then it'll make sense why I'm here today. So I'm going to, Laura, come on up, and I'm going to tell you about our son, David, and she will read it.
So David Johnson, who's 24, of rural Mayville, Horicon, Wisconsin. My son died Wednesday, January 25th, 2012, in Kandahar Province, Afghanistan, and he was serving in the U.S. Army, supporting the Operation Enduring Freedom. David was popular and he was active in his youth, including becoming an Eagle Scout. He did his Army basic training at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, between high school graduation and entering Evangel University in Springfield, Missouri. David majored in political science, and he had a military minor. He was awarded his ROTC scholarship with the Bear Battalion associated with Missouri State in Springfield, Missouri. So in May 2010, he graduated at Evangel University, and he was commissioned as a second lieutenant. But then in January 2011, he graduated from Infantry Basic Officer Leadership Course at Fort Benning, Georgia. David was assigned as a platoon leader to the Charlie Company at the 5th Battalion, 20th Regiment, 3rd Stryker Brigade Combat Team at Joint Base Lewis McChord, Washington. David was promoted to first lieutenant shortly before being deployed to Afghanistan. He was 24 years old, and he had about 60 soldiers based out of a small fire base, which was a land area about no larger than about the size of 2 football fields. And it was in the southern part of Kandahar Province. David and his men were responsible for providing security for the local area villages and assisting in building the schools and roads in that area. The villagers used to call David the man with a big smile, and his men called him Big Dave. So he was about 6 foot. And he was known for, giving his big hugs, and some of the other things that he was also known for was he was just a helper. He liked to help people, and he would, be a real encourager, and that was always important to him. On January 25th, 2012, David and 2 of his squads went on foot patrol to interrogate a mud-walled compound about 1.5 kilometers from his fire base. The compound was in question, and it was possibly manufacturing IEDs. David and his squad neared the compound in question, and they began taking small arms fire from a location that was just to the east. As the small firearms was going on, David and his men had entered the compound, and they began to clear and check for IEDs. And at this point, David decided to step back out as he was controlling the firefight. And at that point, when he stepped back out of the compound, in the threshold of the doorway had been planted an IED. And even though all his men had walked into this and stepped over it the first time, at that point, then it did go off. And at that point, David's radio operator that was right behind him was also injured in the blast, and he would later recover. But David had extensive wounds, and he was medevaced out to Kandahar Airfield, but he died en route. David's buried here in Arlington, Section 60. He has 3 siblings, 2 other brothers, and our youngest is a daughter, Emily.
So now we've told you about David. We've told you his story. And the reason we told you his story is not particularly about David, but that everybody has a story. Everybody has a story. And we say his name, David, because we don't want you to ever forget. And that's why I talked about reading to the names. Now I want to show you a picture of my son, David. Here's David. When I showed you a picture, it's a little different. It's a little different than when we just tell you his name. Young man, very handsome, big guy, Big Dave, beautiful smile. Everything ahead of him. He wanted to be a JAG officer and a lawyer, and he had big plans. But Dave knew he was going into a very dangerous place. You see, before David left for Afghanistan, he met with our pastor. I didn't know this until after, and he said, I think there's a good chance I'm not going to come back. I'm going to be going to one of the dangerous places on earth. In order for, his men would tell me, in order for David to fight, he wasn't afraid. And his men were really surprised he didn't get shot, because when David encountered the enemy many times every day, and he couldn't hear very well during battles, so David would use his hands. He was very good at getting the enemy before they got him. He would expose himself, and he did not. An IED got him, and his men, when Laura told that story, his men scanned that, but the scanner didn't catch it. David didn't make any mistakes. They did like a 200-page report on David's performance. The drones he sent over the night before, the battle plan he did everything correct. They just got him. That's just the way it was. So telling you, now I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about Vietnam veterans, and I assume many of you are in this room. They've been extra kind to Gold Star families and me. Vietnam veterans would come to David's funeral when they preceded his casket when it came in from Dover. They brought it to Milwaukee, and the highways were closed, and Vietnam veterans would line parts of the highways and were in front and behind him when his casket was moved. Then we came to the high school. Vietnam veterans were stationed in front, all holding American flags. Around the whole gymnasium, there was Vietnam veterans, and this was all happening. It was so overwhelming. I didn't understand a lot of what was happening going through this experience. And then when we buried David at Arlington, we were done with the ceremony. I'll never forget. There was all the brass, the military brass left, and it was just Laura and I and our captain, our officer that was assigned to us, and my family, my children and mom and her mom, but there was still 20 other guys there, Vietnam veterans. And I asked, I said, when do you guys leave, or why are you here? And they said, we don't leave until you leave. We're here for you. You see, they loved us, and they loved my son. We'll never forget. We'll be with you. In many places I traveled, the Vietnam veterans would hug me and hold me, and I'm truly, truly grateful. I didn't serve in the military, but I can tell you when a Vietnam veteran hugs me, and I don't know what it is. It's like magic. I hold them, and they hold me. And there's a bond there that I don't know how to describe. Gold Star dad. They love my son. I guess I love them. I didn't even know I had love for people like this. I didn't even know I had that within me, but that's the truth. And so that's the reason for the Faces Project. So when I found out in January 2014, now this will make a little sense, and I won't try to talk too long. I know you've been here a while. I read an article from Wisconsin Public Radio and Television that they're looking for these pictures for Vietnam Veterans Memorial. And I thought, well, they needed 460 pictures in Wisconsin because 1,161 KIAs are listed on the wall. I thought, well, that would be very easy to find. All I have to do is call all my friends at the different newspapers in the state and tell them we're looking for these people, and we'll find them. And so I met with the public television people and public radio, and I had lunch with them and told them, I said, I think we can find these guys and we'll find them by next Memorial Day. And they said, no, we really won't find them all. And I said, no, we're going to find them by next Memorial Day. And this is how we're going to do it. And what we did is we got the list. We worked with the Vietnam, and I did meet with the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. I came to Washington and met with not Tim, but some other folks down there. establish a relationship with them and said, yes, newspapers can help. And we did both on to make a long story short, a national level, but mainly in the state is what I want to talk about, Wisconsin. And what we would do, say in Appleton, say there was 9 pictures missing in Appleton, so we sent to Appleton Post-Crescent 9 names. These are the 9 people we're looking for. In Green Bay, we were looking for about 20 people, so we send up to the Green Bay Gazette, we're looking for these 20 people. And then these newspapers, especially near Veterans and Memorial Day, they would publish these names, hey, we're looking for them, and the public came out and brought the pictures to the newspapers, and then we got them to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. And so then we did this in Wisconsin, and we finished. Well, he talked a little bit about Willie Bedford, and that was the last one found in Wisconsin. And what Tim said is that there was hundreds of people involved, thousands of people who were involved in this. I'm a very small part of that project. I was a connector, and then I connected with newspapers all throughout Wisconsin. And when we were done in Wisconsin, after we found the last one, it was Memorial Day 2015. The last one was a hard one to find, Willie Bedford, 17-year-old. And so what I did, and I had to bring you something printed because it's just the right thing to do in a place like this. And yes, so my little weekly newspaper, the following Memorial Day, after we found them all in Wisconsin, we did find them all. This is the people from my county. There was 9 KIAs on the wall. 3 were missing. We found them right away. But I wanted you to see this. All 1,161 we published, every single one in my newspaper. And the reason I did it, and then I made it available to all newspapers in Wisconsin, is because I knew it would be archived. And Tim talked a little bit about archiving. We archive it a different way. I wanted to make sure that if anyone put, like Tim was saying, you put the name of a hero on a computer or a search, that their picture would pop up. And I wanted to make sure. And so this was uploaded. It was called a system called the BadgerLink system in Wisconsin, and that's how I did it. Then I went after this Wisconsin was done, and at the same time actually I started working other states. Of course, the states near me, Minnesota and Iowa and North Dakota, South Dakota, and then we spread to different states. Illinois was a particularly hard one that had a lot of them. I had to go there a couple times. So what I would do is I would go in Vietnam Veterans Memorial, would send a booth, and I would go to press conventions, and I would tell them about the project and how we're using newspapers to find them, and that's what I did throughout the country. And a couple examples, I just made calls and helped find the people. It's an amazing project, and those of you who have served your country different ways, even working at a place like this, printing, getting information out is serving our country. When you look at the American flag, originally more government and military, but the American flag encompasses, as I was sitting here, I was just thinking about the American flag, it encompasses much more than just military. I wasn't in the military, but I did my part by publishing for America. And you guys are doing your part if you served as a veteran or even just here in the printing industry. The printing industry has been a remarkable contributor to the development of our country. There's no question. I am so honored to have played a part to help find pictures. There was 24,000 missing when I started on the project in 2014. And I sold my newspaper in 2020, and there was about 350 left, but hundreds and hundreds of different people were involved in finding the pictures. It was an awesome project. What does this mean? I have learned that monuments and memorials are primarily for the living. They remind us of the tremendous personal sacrifices made for our great country so that we can be free. It is a place we can reflect, mourn, and most importantly, never forget. It is also a place that should inspire us to live better lives because of the sacrifices made. After our son was killed, Laura and I received counseling from the Army. On the last day of counseling, the counselor asked us a tough question. He said, what do you think what do you think David would want you to do with your life? And really, without much thought, David would want us to live our life fully. He sacrificed. He would not want me to live under a rock or just feel sorry for myself. He would want me to live life fully. A great price was paid. And he would be tickled pink that you're looking at his picture today. He would think that's awesome. And like any first lieutenant would. And so I'm here today. I'm a very proud Gold Star parent. If you ever get to Arlington, he's buried in Section 60, 9947, First Lieutenant David Johnson. I'm very honored to be his dad. I'm very honored to have been in the newspaper business and printing business. And I just want to thank you so much for allowing us to be here today. As I was at Arlington and visited yesterday. There's a group of Navy SEALs that are buried near my son, and they all had flags on them yesterday. And I was looking at the stones, reflecting in a reflective moment, and one of the stones on the Navy SEAL had something on the bottom that caught my eye. And it said that others may live. That's what he said on the bottom of his gravestone. That's awesome, that others may live. And that's the message I have for you today. Yes, the mission is finished or accomplished for finding one set of photos, but the mission is not, the journey is not complete. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial is going to continue looking for other pictures, better pictures, and they're going to continue honoring and helping. And one thing that I didn't talk too much about, but the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, they wanted to help us guys that are part of the Gold Star group from Afghanistan and Iraq. They were going to project all the pictures of the current guys because there was no memorial. And then a few years ago, he talked about reading of the names of the Vietnam guys. What he didn't tell you is they also did a reading of the names of the current guys that were killed from Iraq and Afghanistan. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial did that. And my wife and I had the privilege, my wife read David's name there near the wall when they did that. So just a wonderful thing. So I want to thank you for allowing me to come here. I just want to thank you, veterans, for your service. And God bless the United States of America.
Thank you, Andrew. And in fact, those were very powerful and impactful words from everyone. I really want to say thank you to Hugh, to Tim, to Andrew, and Laura for your participation and for the words today. It's been a pleasure to share this event with everyone. Thank you for taking the time to honor our nation's veterans. A special thanks to Beth Ann Telford for all the work she did and the team she assembled to make this possible today. May God bless you, bless our veterans, and God bless the United States of America. Thank you. And for the Marines and friends of Marines, there's George Lord. I would like to invite you for a 247th birthday cake cutting ceremony over in Carl Hayden Room, right immediately following this. So thank you. It's short and sweet, and it'll taste great. Thank you.